How did Brett Chang build and sell The Peak, Canada's most read daily newsletter, in just 3 years?
We had a number in mind. I mentioned that we were going to do 3 million this year. And so we got to a place that we were both comfortable with. It then became a discussion over how much cash up front versus they wanted to use a vendor note.
We're deep diving into the world of newsletters, what it's like going through an acquisition process, and hear invaluable learnings from a serial entrepreneur.
What I realized was that even if I failed at something, I was still better off longer term that I had done that than if I didn't do it.
Brett, thank you so much for being here.
No, thanks for having me, Mimi.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about what motivated you to start a newsletter business in the first place.
Yeah, the primary driver for us was definitely unemployment. So at the start of COVID, my two co-founders and I, we just didn't have a job. We were working in cannabis before. What we were working on didn't work out. And so we had to figure something else out. We had to pay our rent somehow. So we tried out a bunch of different things. And The Peak was one of the ideas that we had. We thought it was a good idea. We were trying to copy this American business, which I'm sure we'll get into. And as we kind of iterated on it and validated some of our assumptions, we decided this was a business that we wanted to be in. So the primary driver was we wanted to find a business that could pay our rent.
Fair enough. It's difficult to find something that we actually love to do, but also gives us money in this economy.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I've been reading The Peak over the last few years, and what I love about it is how dynamic it is, how fun it is. It covers all the different industries and the relevant news I want to hear. Also love the memes and puns. Was that the format that you had right off the jump, or did you have to iterate over time?
We copied a newsletter in the US called Morning Brew, and we were reading Morning Brew, our friends were reading Morning Brew, but we couldn't find any Canadian content in it. So we thought that there was an opportunity to create a Canadian version of it. So we tried to adopt the same tone, style, and format that they had developed and worked really well for them in the US, but bring it to Canada. So partially that was influenced by them. And then the other half, though, is that we generally thought that Canadian journalism, especially around business news, was unnecessarily jargony and complicated, and that you could, one, simplify it, but two, you could just make it a bit more fun. And that's kind of where the idea for the tone came from, in that we wanted to be Canada's fast and fun Canadian business news, not kind of boring and long.
Well, I think you definitely achieved that. And so walk me through the journey from you getting to that first 1,000 readers and how that's different from when you were at 100,000 readers, for example.
Yes, the first 1,000 readers was really what I like to call hand-to-hand combat. That was us posting on our own social channels. That was reaching out to our friends and family and getting them to subscribe. But really the next iteration upon that was reaching out to them and getting them to share. And once they would share, especially on LinkedIn, is where we saw that more rapid growth come. Once we got to 1,000 users, we kind of validated the product. We saw that people wanted to subscribe to it and then would continue reading it. And so we had confidence that we could keep going with the business.
And would you say LinkedIn was your primary growth driver?
Originally, yeah. For the first 5,000, I think a lot of LinkedIn. And LinkedIn was the highest quality growth channel for us. That's where we were getting the best subscribers, the ones who were sticking with us and reading it consistently.
And outside of LinkedIn, were there other specific growth strategies or marketing strategies that you felt particularly worked well for The Peak?
So beyond the first 1,000 subscribers, it then became a game of paid social acquisition. So we would run lots of different creative and ad formats on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, and that's where we got the majority of our readers, and that was the primary growth driver for us.
And so I've seen over the years, The Peak has also evolved into in-person events, into podcasts. So tell me more about some of these other initiatives that you added onto The Peak and what that meant for your business and the brand.
You know, one of the things that we were trying to accomplish at The Peak was we wanted to show that you could create a sustainable Canadian media business. I think if you look at the industry right now, you see a lot of different companies that are struggling, and there's many different reasons behind that. Some, are within their control, others are outside of their control. What we wanted to do is find a sustainable, growing business model for Canadian media, and the newsletter was one component of that. We had this product that people loved that attracted a really high quality audience, and that there were a number of brands that wanted to get in front of that audience. Now, we always kind of looked to what's an extension of that newsletter. So is that another product that we could do? Is that our podcast? Is that our events? The great thing about events is that they're very high margin, so that we could sell big ticket sponsorships for this high quality audience that these brands want to get in front of. We could get some ticket revenue out of it, which was non-sponsorship revenue. So for all of those reasons, we thought events would be a good add-on on top of our other products. At the same time, it fulfills this mission of ours, which is to make modern Canadian business leaders smarter, faster with what matters, with fun and accessible content.
I would imagine a lot of these initiatives, you had no idea right at the beginning if they would be successful, and they do take a bit of work and investment to get into them. Were there any other bets that you made over the years that didn't pan out?
Yeah, absolutely. One product in particular, well, I guess in the peak context, was we wanted to try something called Crypto Dispatch. It was going to be our crypto newsletter. At the time, crypto was very hot, and we saw that there was lots of advertiser interest on it. So we thought, let's create a separate product just for that. That worked to an extent. I think one mistake that we made with that is that we lost focus. We were now going after a US audience. We were talking about a subject matter that we did not have expertise in. And for all of those reasons, it just didn't make sense for us to pursue that anymore. And we had a bunch, like we do with every other idea, we have a bunch of assumptions that we make about if this can be a viable business. Then we go to market to test those assumptions. And if we can't validate them, usually what we do is we just throw it away. And that's kind of what happened in the case of Crypto Dispatch.
How long did you try before you decided to take a pause on it?
Yeah, that was probably a 6-month effort, and we probably spent probably around $5,000 to $10,000 in acquisition for that, plus the writer. But in the end, we just didn't see it going the way we wanted to, and we saw other opportunities were much more lucrative and much more proven for us than Crypto Dispatch was.
So I'm curious a little bit more about the audience and the reader audience for The Peak and how that differs from the podcast and the events. Would you say those other offshoots are microcosms of your broader audience, or do they speak to specific demographics?
It's a good question. So for the podcast audience, the daily podcast that we do, the Peak Daily, is an entirely independent audience from the newsletter, primarily because it's the same content. So if you read the newsletter and you listen to the podcast, it's just redundant. So that's a totally different audience. Now, among the newsletter itself, one of the magic tricks of running a media company like this is you're able to use that core audience that you have in the daily newsletter and take that and apply them to different products. And so what we would do is get people in the daily newsletter to subscribe to Peak Money or personal finance product, and then those people might come to an event for us. So that is all within a microcosm. The one thing I will say is that the podcast is separate, and then our social channels have very separate audiences as well, because that's less driven by a following of ours and more driven by the algorithm.
When you're talking about channels and social media platforms like TikTok, did you have to find outside help to get you up to speed on something what I would consider not your core competency?
What we try to do is learn as much as we can within our group, and then if we need to bring somebody else in to help us, we do. In the TikTok case, I think the way we approached that was there were a type of videos or a style of videos that we were trying to get done. And so what we would do is we'd film those videos to the best of our ability, and then we try to find editors who can help us with that. One big breakthrough for us was that we were able to go internationally and source talent that was really great at editing, and they were able to help us get those videos to the next level. This was all an iterative process. We would try different formats, and we would learn about what worked and what didn't, and then we would focus in on what worked and develop a process so that we consistently create and put out a number of those videos to keep that momentum.
Got it. And when you say looking internationally for help, you mean leveraging freelance marketplaces?
Yeah, we actually ended up hiring somebody in the Philippines who is our full-time video editor, and they'll produce for us 2 to 3 videos a week. That allowed us to create the amount of content that we thought we needed to consistently get the results that we wanted in terms of audience growth, but also just total views.
Got it. And I think you mentioned that you had big sponsorships for these in-person events. Can you speak a little bit more about the different revenue channels of the business?
Yeah, so the primary revenue channel is advertising. So these are companies that want to tell their stories to our audience. The audience is affluent Canadian modern business leaders. There's a number of different brands that want to get in front of these people for a variety of different reasons. In particular, we focus on financial institutions and Canadian telcos. And the idea is that through a newsletter like The Peak, you're able to authentically tell what you're all about and build that brand affinity, which will then, one, get these affluent, high-value consumers to sign up for your product, and then hopefully stick with you down the road. So the advertising components are our primary revenue channel. That has an extension to it, which is the events. So the events that they'll sponsor because they want further exposure to this audience. They want to build a deeper relationship with them. And then on top of that, we do some content creation. So besides the ads that we put into the newsletters, which are custom created by our team and our copywriting team, we also will do custom social videos as well and branded content, which again takes that same Peak tone and voice, but applies it to their story and hopefully gets the response that they want from our audience.
I've worked with various brands before, and sometimes they're very particular and they're saying, hey, we're working with you as a brand. We just want access to your audience and we want to get that exposure, but you have to say these words, you have to use these assets. How collaborative was it for you?
It's very collaborative. The Most important thing for us, though, when we started the Peak was we wanted it to be a great reader experience. And I think this has been true for all the other products that we've created as well. And in order to do that, we didn't just want to put in a banner ad into the middle of the newsletter. It just felt out of place. And so we wanted to write the copy for these ads ourselves. And we wanted to write them in the same tone and format of the newsletter. Now, not only did we think that that was a better experience for the reader, but it also got better results for the brands. If you look at the ads in the newsletter now or on the podcast, they kind of feel like just an extension of the product. They're written in the same tone and format, and you might even mistake it as just another story, even though it is labeled sponsored, but that gets better results for the brands overall. And I think we've done a pretty good job of convincing them that they should work collaboratively with us to create this content. We'll obviously go back to them for multiple rounds of revisions and edits, but in the end, we find that our approach is superior in terms of both the reader experience, but also the results that we can generate for the brands.
I definitely agree. Out of curiosity, how much of those sponsorship opportunities are inbound versus outbound?
It's a changing percentage. Currently, I'd probably say that 60% of them are outbound and 40% of them are inbound, but that's kind of hopefully, as any company or publisher is hoping to do, we're looking to increase that inbound to 40, 50, 60, 70%, which makes the whole sales cycle much easier.
And so the Peak is still relatively new as an organization, but one of the biggest milestones is being acquired by ZoomerMedia. So can you walk me through a little bit about your decision process to actually sell the business?
Yeah, so I had been talking to the COO of ZoomerMedia, Omri, over the past few years, just casually. And they came to us and thought what we were doing was really interesting and exciting and fit well into their vision. We had no intention to sell at the time. We thought that the business required kind of another year before we would get to a place where anybody would be even interested in it. But we also knew that we had a really good business. We were on track to do $3 million in revenue and about $900,000 in EBITDA. And so, we had this tension where we had an offer from Zoomer come in, but we also knew that we had a really good business, and we had to try to figure out what we wanted from the next 5 years, where we thought the Peak would be best suited, whether it was with a partner who shared the same vision as us, or if it was continuing to be independent and doing what we do best. And through conversations with Zoomer, what we realized was that we shared the same vision for Canadian media at large. And it was very easy to see how the Peak would not only fit into the ZoomerMedia family, but also how we could leverage all their different resources, whether it's the scale of audience of BlogTO and Daily Hive that we could use to acquire new readers for the Peak, or if it was their sales capacity and their relationships with media agencies that we just didn't have and took a lot of time to build those relationships. So for us, the deal just made sense for the business. It could really accelerate our growth, and ultimately, we're in a better position now than we were before to achieve our vision of becoming one of the most recognizable media brands in Canada.
And how did you navigate that entire process? When you say we, I'm assuming that you had, not just you, but a team of support to help you through this.
The primary team was myself, Taylor, and Alex, me and my two co-founders. And then we leaned on our lawyer, Spencer Berger at Stegman Elliott. He's an exceptional counsel. And then we had our investors as well. So we originally raised about $412,000 for the business. We raised that all on safe notes, and we would go to them with a lot of questions throughout the process about how best to approach it. This is even besides just the should we even do it in the first place, which was very helpful. But then as you kind of go through, this is a experience that not many people have, and if you do have it, it's very rare. And so there's not a lot of resources out there advising people on how to sell their business or what to look for in the process or how to treat this particular legal issue with regards to, working capital or reps and warranties or all these different things that you wouldn't normally be familiar with as an entrepreneur. So it was very helpful to have a network of people that we could kind of go to and bounce ideas off of.
And were there any unexpected challenges or lessons that came throughout that deal process? Having been in a few deals, nothing goes as planned or as smoothly as you would think, from political issues or negotiating those legal terms that have a material impact down the road. Can you share some insight into something that came up that might not have been foreseen?
My takeaway from the experience is that when you're doing a deal of any size or any type of transaction, there are always thousands of ways that each party can screw each other on the deal. And what the lawyers are trying to do is mitigate that and bring it as close to zero as both parties are comfortable with. It will never be zero, but they want to create comfort among both parties that they're sufficiently covered for the vast majority of items that could be harmful to each respective party. That was a learning experience for me, and it was frustrating in that you're going back and forth on these things that have remote chances of actually being impactful and having to sort through them with one, your counsel, but two, the counter counsel, and it was just a lot of that. And it was turning documents back and forth until you got to a place where, like I said, everybody was kind of comfortable with it, and then ultimately you would feel good signing it. Even though there was still some liability and risk to be had, you would deem that that was okay. In terms of the particulars, ZoomerMedia was a great partner on this, and there wasn't anything particularly shocking that came of it. You're absolutely right that throughout the process there are always different curveballs that come at you, and you have to adjust accordingly. But as far as deals go, I think this was probably on the smoother end than more complicated.
And when you're talking about finding that cultural fit with ZoomerMedia, how did you assess that?
The best way to assess that is just through conversation. So you don't have much else to go on. So it's talking to as many people as you can who are within the organization, who are outside of the organization, that understand the organization, and building up that trust with the stakeholders that you're dealing with on the deal as well. And so with all of that taken into consideration, we were able to assess that this was the right culture fit for us. They shared the vision, and we were confident that we were doing the right thing when we were making the deal.
Very important. And on the quantitative side of things, how did you go about valuing the business and achieving a fair value for this acquisition?
Valuation's tough. There's no science to it. It's a lot of kind of wizardry and magic. And so you kind of pull a number out of thin air based on what you think you should be worth. And really, the only determinant for your valuation is ultimately going to be the market. So whatever a buyer is willing to pay is ultimately the valuation that's put on the business. In this case, we had a number in mind. I mentioned that we were going to do $3 million this year. We thought that a 2x revenue was kind of in the range of where we would be looking at. Zoomer agreed in that range, ended up being $5 million in total compensation or consideration. And so we got to a place that we were both comfortable with. It then became a discussion over how much cash up front versus they wanted to use a vendor note device. And so how much did you want to push and defer? And that kind of became a negotiation in itself, but we were in the range there. And what we were looking for is a good outcome for all shareholders. So both myself, Taylor, and Alex, plus our investors. And then we also wanted to make sure that we had a good path to profitability for Zoomer, where that if they were to acquire this asset, that they could earn their money back in a fairly quick sequence that would then be able to create contribution margin for them to reinvest back into some of their other properties and grow that overall ecosystem.
Definitely. You mentioned that, a lot of the valuation is tied to where the market sentiment is going. I definitely agree with that. And so from your perspective, what role do you think timing played in terms of having, growing, not just the exit itself, but growing your newsletter business?
Yeah, it's a good question. Timing plays a big role. A lot of this stuff is luck. There's a lot of luck involved in creating the peak. We had started many other businesses before, and some of them you even know about, Mimi, and they all failed for the most part. And they didn't fail necessarily because we were bad at them or we made big mistakes. It was likely timing and luck that was the biggest contributor to that. At the same time, it was timing and luck that contributed to the success of the peak. We were there at a good time when newsletters were gaining prominence. We had gotten in early enough that there was a gap in the Canadian market that we saw that didn't exist in the US. The US was much more developed than us, and so we could jump in there. There was some luck in terms of market timing, sure. One of the considerations or one of the concerns that I had throughout the process of acquisition was speed, and that was because anything can happen. The market could tank, and then that changes your valuation because there's less appetite to do these types of deals. And so there was a lot of that as well at a macro side. But yeah, overall, it was, I think, a lot of timing, a lot of luck, and that was a big factor in our ability to do this.
I think over the last 12 to 18 months, I would say specifically, newsletter as a category has grown tremendously. So from your perspective, what is the state of the nation of newsletters, and where do you think the newsletter business is going?
The reason why we started a newsletter, and this was the premise for the big push of newsletters, which I think happened about 4 or 5 years ago in the US, let's say 5 years ago in the US, was that there was, in media, this huge drive to social. And there were companies created off of social. The BuzzFeeds, the Vices, that were able to generate tons of traffic through Facebook and Instagram and Twitter that created, for a moment, tens of millions, if not billions of dollars in value to them. What happened to those companies was that the algorithms changed. So the platforms, they decided that they no longer wanted to have this type of content on their platform. In fact, what was going on behind the scenes is that they were realizing that many people were going on Facebook, seeing these BuzzFeed articles, clicking on those BuzzFeed articles, and leaving Facebook. And there's really no incentive for them to have people to leave Facebook when they want people to have them on platforms so they can serve ads to them. So they changed the algorithm, and nearly overnight, these businesses collapsed. And the big lesson from that a lot of people in media took away was that you can no longer rely on platforms for your audience. You have to have some ownership over that audience. And that's where the idea or the prominence for newsletters came, which is that you can create a list of emails and you own that audience. At the peak, we send an email to them every single day. We're part of their routine. And Gmail or Google or Facebook really have no real control over that. There are some levers that they can pull, but by and large, there's no real control over them, which means that we own that audience. It goes with us anywhere we go. We can change the platform and no problem. People will still have that routine and keep that routine, and we'll still hit people's inboxes. And so newsletters were really important for that specific purpose. Now I think newsletters have grown and become more advanced. There's lots of them out there and people are doing really cool things with them. I still think there's lots of opportunities to grow in that space. There's lots of niches that you can tackle. But I think what's really neat about newsletters is, one, you control that audience, and two, you can create a routine out of people where you send it at the same time every day or every week, and people look forward to seeing it and engage with it consistently, which is just something you don't get in other media products.
I love how deeply you understand the market, and clearly that's why you started the Peak. You've started many businesses before, and you mentioned that they didn't work out. Can you share a little bit more about what those experiences were like and why they failed?
You got to go back in time here because I've been doing this for a while. We started an agency, me and Taylor, who's still my co-founder today. We started our first business was a digital public affairs agency. It's a normal services business. We were working with different stakeholders that had challenges with the government. They wanted to run these digital campaigns to show that they had public support for these issues. That was a fine, normal business, but we got in a bit of a dispute with our co-founder at the time. We were very young. We didn't know how to grow or scale a business. And so we left that. We then started something called Line 6, which was a bus that we ran from Liberty Village to Union Station. It was a great idea in concept, and we got lots of interest around it, and there was tons of media around the idea. The challenge was that the economics were not very good and that it was, by the letter of the law, likely illegal. And so we moved off of that for a variety of different reasons. And then we tried some other ideas in the interim. None of those really worked either. And then I went to Uber. I spent 3 years at Uber. I left Uber, and then we did Leap Forward. We got into the cannabis space. We were hosting these events. We were trying to build a community. We then wanted to get access to some of that deal flow that we were seeing, some good entrepreneurs that were starting businesses. We wanted to be able to invest in them, so we started an accelerator and raised a small fund to do it. And, that probably didn't work for the same reason that every other idea that we tried didn't work. It was probably timing. And I think that's a good point that you make, which is I think we were a bit late to cannabis. It played out in a different way than our thesis expected it to play out. There wasn't this explosion of entrepreneurial activity. In fact, there was the opposite of it. And so, I can attribute it to a few things, which is, one, our failures would be due to we were young, we weren't experienced, we didn't know how to build a business, a sustainable business, and we learned a lot through that process. We didn't even know how to raise money. I think for Line 6, we probably could have raised money. If I did it today, I could have raised money for sure. I didn't know that at the time. 2, I think the timing just didn't work out. We missed the timing, which is unfortunate, but it happens. I think those are probably the 2 primary contributors to our failures.
Yeah, those are really, really important. And I think those are also things that you read about them and you know of them conceptually, but until you've actually experienced them as an entrepreneur and as an operator, it's difficult to actually grasp. And so for other serial entrepreneurs out there who might be bouncing around with different ideas, what are some advice or tips that you could give them to actually say, this idea out of the rest of the portfolio ideas actually will be the most likely to succeed and you should actually go all in on this?
The best learning that we had, and we definitely applied this to the Peak, was that you have to be iterative in your approach to launching these businesses. What I mean by that is, and I've mentioned this a few times now, when we launch something, we have a bunch of different assumptions that we make about things as simple as, will somebody subscribe to the Peak? Will somebody consistently read the newsletter? Will we be able to go to an advertiser and sell an ad? Can we sell it for $100? Can we sell it for $500? Can we sell it for $1,000? What do we actually need to be profitable and sustainable in this business? Can we sell the ad for that amount? So you have this list of assumptions that you make that you're like, in the best case scenario, we'll be able to build a business and prove that all these assumptions are true, and this thing will just grow and take off and be successful. What we do now is we work backwards from that. So we list out those assumptions. This is not new. I didn't make this up. It's in the lean startup. But we list those assumptions. When we go out there, we try to iteratively test them one by one. And at each validation of those assumptions, we have greater confidence in the business that it's going to work. And there's a certain point, a tipping point, where you realize that this is no longer a concept, but it is now a feasible business. And you can really focus on that and invest your time and resources into growing it. That's definitely not what we did with the Peak, and that's what we'll do with any future businesses that we start as well.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important advice. And sometimes when you're doing this for the first time, it starts with a simple question. I think it's easier to approach some of these potential needs of the business and overcomplicate things and overthink things. And you're worrying about the wrong things, but when you actually simplify to what is your revenue model going to be? What exactly are you trying to do? What audience are you trying to reach? And then how do you actually get those? What are the metrics and or what are the specific ways to get them? I think is really, really nice to be able to break it down between something that's higher level and something that's lower level and being able to validate those assumptions.
Yeah, and you have to get people to pay you.
Yeah.
In the end, that's the most important thing, is that somebody will give you money for whatever you're doing, and you have to be able to do that repeatedly. If you do that repeatedly, you've got a great business. If you can't do that, the business doesn't work.
And inevitably, some of these assumptions don't pan out and you're going to be faced with no's or things that don't go as planned. And so how have you dealt with failure and burnout over the years?
Yeah, I look back on, there was a certain point where I think I got used to the failure. After a few different endeavors, what I realized was that even if I failed at something, I was still better off longer term that I had done that than if I didn't do it. So the best example of this is my own career. I graduated from university not with a particularly useful degree. I had a history and poli sci degree from U of T, and I really had no path to be able to generate real wealth for myself or my family except for entrepreneurship. And what I noticed after a few of these failures is that every time I did it, there would be an opportunity that opened up after it that I did not expect that was helpful for me in my progression. The best example of this was when we launched this bus in Liberty Village and we got all this media for it. At the end of it, I felt awful. We had put a lot of effort into it. It was a public business, and so it was almost humiliating to us that we couldn't make it work. People were so excited for us and what we were doing because we were in the newspaper and on TV. And so when that failed, I felt terrible, and I felt like a failure, and we had lost money, and it was our own money, and it was a tough time. But what opened up was that the Uber guys got interested in what we were doing, and I started talking to them, and then I wanted a job after so I could pay my rent. It always goes back to paying my rent. And so I reached out to them, and we had a conversation, and eventually I got my job at Uber. And that was really helpful in my business education, just learning how to be a good operator of a business. I learned a lot of that at Uber, and so that Line 6 experience, it opened the door for Uber. I joined Uber, and then through Uber, I learned how to operate a business, which then is directly connected to our success at the Peak. So that was the primary realization I had. And once I had that, failures after it, they weren't as troubling or tough on me because I had saw that there was a better outcome ahead. But earlier on, when I was younger, it was challenging.
When did you know that you're an entrepreneur? Because I think coming out of university, you weren't particularly taking entrepreneurship or business classes. You went the entrepreneurship route, and then you were in a large organization, theoretically with a salary, benefits, etc.
I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur until I was, in my mid-20s. It just wasn't something that I I grew up around, and it was all very foreign to me. And even business as a concept was very foreign to me. It felt almost inaccessible. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know where to start to learn about it. What the turning point was is truthfully that there were no other options for me. I wasn't smart enough to go to law school. I didn't want to just pursue random post-undergrad degrees to see what's out there. That wasn't my path. I liked doing things. This is, I think, the one thing that I can tie to my current entrepreneurship was that when I was growing up, I was involved in politics, and even up until university. In politics, a lot of what I enjoyed the most, putting things together, working on campaigns, recruiting people to help me on campaigns, coming up with strategies and how to communicate. All of that was fairly entrepreneurial, if not in the business sense. So I think that's where I got the spark for it. And then over the years, as I read more about it and listened to more podcasts and watched more videos, I got increasingly interested in it. And then there was probably a point where I thought of myself as an entrepreneur. And it was likely through that Uber experience that I got the real hands-on training on what it's like to work in a high-performance startup environment. And that, I think, put me on the best path.
And how has your definition of success in life changed over the course of those years?
The primary goal for myself was to earn. As I mentioned, I didn't have a clear path available to me. I just wasn't going to law school. I wasn't going to be an engineer. I wasn't going to be a kind of skilled professional. And so if you don't do that, there are very limited paths available to you to generate wealth. And entrepreneurship was just one of the few that existed. And truthfully, every endeavor that we did, we enjoyed doing it. It was a fun journey, but ultimately our goal was to have some type of liquidity event, some type of exit, and be able to generate wealth for ourselves. And so that was the primary driver and has been the primary driver the whole time. Now I think we've, semi-achieved that. And my definition of success will change now, I think, but it's also part of the stage of life that I'm in. So, I think probably more now my definition of success would be maintaining and cultivating the relationships with the people that you care about and love. And that's probably the most important thing in life. And it's less so the financial outcomes.
Absolutely. But it's hard not to identify money as one of them. I think a lot of people like to shy away from actually saying that. I think people are working on this bigger mission rather than saying I'm just here to make money, which I honestly think is the reality for a lot of people. And as you've grown, in terms of your mindset and perspective on life and business has changed over time, what have you learned about yourself as a co-founder, as a leader, and as a manager?
The biggest learning I've had about myself and how I function over the past 10 years, or I think the biggest change that I've made, is that I'm much more patient now than I was before. When I was younger, I was very impulsive. I would make quick decisions. I was combative is not the right word, but I was argumentative in workplaces, thinking that my way was always right. Now I'm much more patient, open-minded. I listen to other views. I can change my mind, and I think that's all been very helpful. So I like to think that that's my style, in that, yes, I move quick. Yes, I have opinions on things, but I'm not closed to changing my mind, and I'm open to many different viewpoints.
Well, Brett, I think your story is very inspiring, and a lot of Canadians and a lot of Canadian entrepreneurs are going to be looking up to you and your path and your success. So I'm excited to follow you along in the rest of your journey. But before I let you go, I do have a few speed round questions for you. If you could have one superpower to increase your productivity, what would it be?
If I could focus for a longer period of time, this is the most obvious answer to this question, but if I just had a better attention span, I feel like that would dramatically increase my productivity.
Oh, that speaks to me for sure. Secondly, if you could trade your life with another successful entrepreneur or business person for one day, who would that be?
Oh, that's a really tough one. I'm going to go with, I'm trying to think backwards from the companies that I admire. I think Yvonne Chouinard of Patagonia is such an interesting character who has such an interesting background and a unique way of running his business that would be neat to see that. And then I'll give you another answer too. Some of these hedge fund guys, Ray Dalio or Bill Ackman, I'm just interested in that world and how they make decisions. And so I'd be interested to see how that works on a day-to-day basis.
Very, very fascinating. What is one newsletter that you do read?
I read Semaphore, which is a new product that Ben Smith, who was formerly of BuzzFeed News and the New York Times, has created. They have this product called Flagship, and it's their daily newsletter, and it has the best global coverage. So even at the start of it, they show a map, and they have all these different numbers on the map, and each number corresponds to the story. And so you'll hear about the unrest in Burkina Faso, and you'll hear about how Saudi Arabia is getting into mining and Brazil and all these different international stories that are hard to find normally.
Yeah, and distilled in a very, very simple
Yeah.
and digestible way. What is one non-negotiable in your day?
Coffee. I think coffee is very important to me, and that's only because I'm addicted. That's why it's non-negotiable. Coffee is probably the number one.
And last but not least, where can people find you to stay up to date on what you're up to?
You can find me on x.com at bchang, and you can find me on Instagram, LinkedIn, whatever, Brett Chang.
Perfect. This was a lot of fun. Brett, thank you again for having this conversation, for being so open about your journey.
Thanks, Mimi.